Commander Vork had been leading diplomatic tours for 30 years, and he thought nothing could surprise him anymore. The Archive of Ancient Civilizations was the galaxy's greatest museum, a massive station that floated in the darkness between stars. Inside its halls were treasures from species that had turned to dust long before most current civilizations had even learned to make fire. Today's tour group was smaller than usual. A few council members, some historians, and one human. Captain Rachel Torres walked near the back of the group, her boots clicking softly against the polished floor. She'd only been Earth's representative for 3 months, and Vork could tell she was trying hard not to look too impressed by everything around her. The humans were still new to galactic politics. Their species had only made contact 15 years ago, and most council members still saw them as curious but insignificant. They had no great technology, no ancient wisdom, nothing that made them special compared to the 1,000 other species in the galaxy. The group moved through halls filled with wonders. Crystallized songs from the Veltha choir worlds. Probability engines from the Kesh Dominion. A fragment of living starlight preserved in temporal amber. Rachel looked at each display with quiet attention, asking occasional questions that showed she was actually thinking about what she saw. They entered the Hall of Fallen Empires, where the oldest artifacts were kept. Here, the lights were dimmer, more respectful. These weren't just old objects. These were the last remaining pieces of civilizations that had risen, flourished, and vanished before the current galactic order even existed. Moth, the head curator, floated ahead of them. The ancient being species didn't have a name anymore because they were the last one left. Moth had been tending this archive for longer than some stars had been burning. This section contains our deepest mysteries, Moth's voice whispered through their translators. Items we have studied for millennia without fully understanding. They stopped before a containment field that glowed with soft blue light. Inside, suspended in the field's embrace, was a blade. Not a weapon of some advanced civilization with energy fields or molecular disruption technology. Just a simple sword, its metal dark with age, its edge still sharp despite the countless years. This, Moth said with something like reverence in their voice, is our oldest artifact. Our best analysis suggests it was forged over 8 billion years ago. The metallurgy is beyond anything we understand. The alloys should not be possible. The civilization that created this existed before our records begin, before the first galactic empire rose, before most of the current star systems even formed. The delegates murmured appreciatively. Vork had heard this presentation before. The blade was beautiful in its simplicity, but it was just another mystery in a museum full of them. Then Rachel stepped forward. Her movement was sudden enough that Vork's hand instinctively went to his weapon. But Rachel wasn't threatening anyone. She was staring at the blade with an expression that Vork had never seen on a human face before. Not awe. Not curiosity. Recognition. That's a wakizashi, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. The translator took a moment to process the unfamiliar word. Vork frowned. Please clarify your statement. Rachel moved closer to the containment field, her eyes never leaving the blade. It's a Japanese short sword. A wakizashi. We use them for training in traditional martial arts. Her hand moved unconsciously to her side, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. I've been training with swords exactly like this since I was 6 years old. Moth's form rippled with what might have been surprise or concern. Captain Torres, that is impossible. This weapon predates your species by billions of years. It predates your planet's formation. But Rachel was shaking her head, stepping as close to the field as the safety barriers allowed. Look at the curvature. See that angle? That's specific to Japanese sword-making techniques developed in feudal Japan. And there, the way the handle would have been wrapped, the tang construction, the balance point. She pointed at details that Vork couldn't even see. This isn't just similar to our designs. This is our design. Parallel evolution of blade technology, Vork said dismissively. Sharp edges develop similarly across. No. Rachel's voice was firm now, confident. Look at the wear pattern on the edge. That's not combat damage. Those are marks from kata practice, from performing the same training forms over and over again. I have the exact same wear pattern on my practice blade at home. The group had gone silent. Even the historians, who had heard every wild theory about this blade over the years, were listening carefully now. Moth floated closer to Rachel, studying the human with ancient eyes. You are certain of this? I've been practicing kenjutsu my entire adult life. My grandmother taught me, and her grandmother taught her, going back generations in an unbroken line. I know these blades. Rachel's voice carried absolute certainty. Commander Moth, I don't know how this is possible, but that sword is human. Or our swords are copies of something much, much older than we ever imagined. A scholar named Prin, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. Commander Vork, there's something you should know. This isn't the first time. Vork turned sharply. Explain. Prin pulled up a datapad, fingers moving quickly. Over the past decade, human delegates and explorers have identified artifacts across Council space that match their cultural objects. A flute in the Deneb collection that matches ancient Sumerian designs. Geometric patterns in the Oriax Museum identical to Navajo weaving. A meditation bell on Proxima Station that resembles Tibetan instruments. 17 confirmed cases so far. All of the artifacts predate known galactic history. The implications hung in the air like a physical weight. Rachel looked at Moth. I need to examine this blade more closely. Please. Moth was silent for a long moment, then slowly nodded. I will arrange it. But Captain Torres, if what you suggest is true, then we must reconsider everything we thought we knew about galactic history. As the curator moved away to make arrangements, Vork noticed Prin watching Rachel with an expression of deep concern. The scholar leaned close and whispered something that made Vork's blood run cold. Commander, if humans have connections to pre-galactic civilizations, then we need to find out why. And we need to find out what happened to those civilizations. Because every single one of them is extinct. Deep in the archive's computer core, systems that had been dormant for millions of years suddenly flickered to life. The blade's containment field had detected something, a quantum resonance it had been programmed to watch for across the ages. In response, sealed doors 3 kilometers below the museum floor began to unlock for the first time since they had been closed. The army was waking up. The examination chamber was small and sterile, with walls that seemed to absorb sound. Rachel stood before the containment field, now lowered to allow closer inspection, while Moth monitored everything from a control station nearby. Security protocols were strict. The blade hadn't been removed from its protective field in over 2,000 years. Rachel leaned in, her eyes tracing every detail of the ancient weapon. She pulled out her personal datapad and began taking notes, occasionally asking Moth to adjust the lighting or rotate the blade slightly. There, she said, pointing to a spot near where the handle would have attached. That's a maker's mark. It's almost worn completely smooth, but you can still see the impression. We have marks like this on traditional blades back home. Each swordsmith had their own signature. Moth's instruments hummed as they scanned the area Rachel indicated. Remarkable. Our sensors detected an irregularity there but classified it as natural wear. You identified it by sight alone. Because I know what to look for. Rachel's voice carried a mix of wonder and confusion. The balance point is exactly where it should be for a wakizashi. The curve is precise. Even the way the metal was folded during forging, you can see the pattern in the right light. This is a technique called pattern welding. Japanese smiths perfected it centuries ago on Earth. She stepped back, running a hand through her hair. But that's impossible. This blade is billions of years old. Humans weren't even a species yet. We were still probably swimming in oceans as single-celled organisms. The door to the examination chamber slid open. Prin entered quickly, carrying a data tablet and looking agitated. Captain Torres, I've compiled everything. You need to see this. Prin activated a holographic display that filled the air between them. Images appeared, dozens of them, each showing a different artifact from various museums and collections across Council space. 17 confirmed matches so far, Prin began, swiping through the images. This flute was discovered on an abandoned colony world in the Outer Reach. It's 6 billion years old. Last month, a human archaeologist identified it as nearly identical to instruments from ancient Sumerian culture on Earth, around 3000 BCE by your calendar. Another image appeared. These geometric patterns were found carved into a moon orbiting a dead star. Age, 4 billion years. A human artist recognized them immediately as traditional Navajo designs, specific to the Dine people of North America. More images followed in rapid succession. A meditation bell. A carved stone that matched Celtic knotwork. A piece of fabric with patterns identical to West African textile traditions. A tool that resembled Aboriginal Australian craftsmanship. Each artifact impossibly old. Each one matching human cultural objects with impossible precision. It's not just the objects themselves, Prin continued. It's the purpose behind them. Almost all of these items are related to practice, to teaching, to discipline. Training instruments. Meditation tools. Teaching aids. Not weapons of war. Not advanced technology. Just simple objects used for passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Rachel stared at the display, her mind racing. Someone was teaching. Billions of years ago, someone was traveling between stars and teaching civilizations these practices. Or, Moth said quietly, someone taught your ancestors, and that knowledge survived on Earth while dying out everywhere else. The implications were staggering. Vork, who had joined them in the chamber, shook his head firmly. This is coincidence. Parallel development. Sharp blades and geometric patterns are universal. We cannot jump to conclusions about. Commander, Prin interrupted, which was unusual enough to make everyone pause. There's more. I've been researching the legends that Curator Moth mentioned. The stories about the first teachers. Moth's form seemed to solidify, becoming more focused. Those are just stories. Myths that archivists tell each other. Maybe, Prin said. But myths often have roots in truth. I found references across dozens of extinct civilizations. Different names, different languages, but the same basic story. Beings who walked between stars, teaching discipline and focus to any species willing to learn. They didn't conquer. They didn't demand worship. They just taught and then moved on. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. And then what? Where did they go? That's where the stories end, Prin said softly. Every civilization that mentions them says the same thing. The teachers came, they shared their knowledge, and then they vanished. As if they simply stepped back and let their students continue without them. Rachel turned back to the ancient wakizashi. An idea was forming, something that seemed crazy but felt right. Moth, can I try something? The curator hesitated. What do you propose? I want to perform a kata. A training form. With the blade still in containment, I just want to move through the positions as if I were holding it. Vork started to object, but Moth raised a hand, silencing him. Proceed, Captain Torres. But slowly. My senses will monitor everything. Rachel took a breath, centering herself the way her grandmother had taught her decades ago. She stepped back, giving herself room, and assumed the starting position. Her feet found their places naturally, her weight balanced, her imaginary sword held in a guard position. Then she began to move. The kata was one of the oldest she knew, a basic form that every student learned in their first year. Her movements were fluid and precise, each position flowing into the next. Step, turn, strike, block, breathe. The rhythm was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Moth's senses began to shriek. Rachel stopped mid-form, concerned she'd triggered some alarm. But Moth wasn't looking at her. The curator was staring at the readouts with an expression of pure shock. The blade, Moth whispered. It's resonating. Rachel looked at the ancient wakizashi. To her eyes, it appeared unchanged, still floating peacefully in its containment field. But Moth's instruments told a different story. Quantum-level resonance, the curator said, hands moving rapidly across controls. The blade is responding to your movements, Captain Torres. At the subatomic level, it's matching the rhythm of your kata. As if it recognizes what you're doing. That's impossible, Vork said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Prin was already checking something on the datapad. Curator Moth, are there any other artifacts in the archive that might respond similarly? Moth was quiet for a moment, then slowly turned to look at them. When the ancient curator spoke, there was something like fear in their voice. Yes. The restricted collection. The Army of Echoes. What's that? Rachel asked. A sealed section 3 kilometers below us. It contains artifacts too dangerous or too inexplicable for public display. Items that we've kept locked away for millions of years because we don't understand them and fear what they might do. Moth's hands trembled slightly over the controls. I just received an automated alert. The blade's resonance triggered something. The armorous vault door, which hasn't opened since my order sealed it in the age before records, is unlocking. The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of equipment. Finally, Rachel spoke. Then I think we need to see what's down there. Moth looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes. I think we do. But Captain Torres, I must warn you. The army was sealed for a reason. Whatever is down there, my predecessors deemed it too significant to share with the galaxy. We may be about to open something that was meant to stay closed. Rachel thought about the ancient blade, about the impossible connections between human culture and pre-galactic civilizations, about teachers who walked between stars billions of years ago. I think it's already opening, she said quietly. We're just following where it leads. The descent took 20 minutes in a lift that Rachel hadn't even known existed. Moth explained that most of the archive staff had never been to this level. Some didn't even know it was here. The deeper they went, the older everything looked. The walls changed from modern metals to ancient stone, then to materials that Rachel couldn't identify at all. Vork had insisted on coming, despite his obvious discomfort. Prin practically vibrated with excitement, recording everything. Rachel just felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if she were walking towards something that had been waiting for her specifically. The lift doors opened onto a corridor carved from solid rock. Emergency lighting cast everything in pale blue, creating shadows that seemed to move on their own. Their footsteps echoed in the silence. At the end of the corridor stood a massive door. It was covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if Rachel's eyes couldn't quite focus on them properly. The door was already open, just a crack, light spilling through from whatever lay beyond. This door has been sealed for 4 million years, Moth said quietly. My order placed 7 different locks on it, each requiring authorization from the council itself to open. But when your blade resonated, Captain Torres, every single lock disengaged on its own. What's inside? Rachel asked, though part of her already knew. We call it the Army of Echoes. My predecessors placed artifacts here that they couldn't explain, things that seemed to have purposes beyond our understanding. Dangerous things. Moth paused at the threshold. Are you certain you wish to continue? Rachel stepped forward and pushed the door open wider. The chamber beyond was vast, easily the size of a football field. But it wasn't filled with weapons of mass destruction or doomsday devices. Instead, Rachel saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Training equipment. Thousands upon thousands of pieces of training equipment. She walked into the chamber like someone in a dream. Wooden practice swords lined one wall, each from a different world, different eras. Staves of varying lengths and materials stood in neat rows. There were meditation cushions, balance beams, practice targets, movement guides carved in holographic stone that showed figures performing forms and exercises. These are teaching tools, Prin whispered, or in their voice. Rachel moved from display to display, recognizing more than she would have thought possible. A wooden sword that could have come from any dojo in Japan. A staff configuration identical to ones used in Filipino martial arts. Stone weights that matched ancient Greek training methods. Rhythm instruments like those used in Brazilian capoeira. But there were also items she didn't recognize at all. Training tools from species long extinct, their purposes mysterious but clearly meant for practice and discipline rather than combat. Every piece shows signs of use, Moth observed, scanning the room. Not battle damage. Repeated, careful practice. Someone used these items over and over, teaching the same movements, the same forms. At the center of the chamber stood a crystal structure about the size of a person. It was dark when they entered, but as Rachel approached, it began to glow with a soft amber light. Captain Torres, perhaps you should, Vork began, but it was too late. The crystal flared bright, and a holographic figure appeared before them. It was humanoid, but not quite human. Not quite any species Rachel recognized. The being wore simple robes, practical and worn. Its face was kind but carried the weight of immense age. When it spoke, the words came in a language so old that even the advanced translators struggled. But slowly, meaning began to form. If you see this message, then a student has returned. We are the pathkeepers, and this is our legacy. The figure began to walk, and the hologram expanded, showing scenes from across the galaxy. The pathkeeper teaching a reptilian species how to balance and breathe. Showing an insectoid civilization meditation techniques. Demonstrating star forms to beings made of living crystal. We traveled the stars for 1 million generations, the voice continued. Not to conquer, not to rule, but to teach. We discovered something that we believe to be a fundamental truth of the universe. Civilizations that develop technology alone, without discipline of body and mind, destroy themselves. They create weapons they cannot control. They build societies that fragment under stress. They forget how to be still, how to focus, how to move with purpose. The hologram showed beautiful cities crumbling, advanced species tearing themselves apart from within. So we taught a different path. Physical discipline. Mental focus. The warrior's peace, not the warrior's violence. We taught any species willing to learn that true strength comes from harmony between body, mind, and spirit. Rachel felt tears forming in her eyes without fully understanding why. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory, the lessons she'd been taught as a child about why they practiced the forms. We seeded these teachings across thousands of worlds, the Pathkeeper continued. And then we did the hardest thing any teacher must do. We stepped back. We let our students become teachers themselves. We trusted that the lessons would survive without us to enforce them. The hologram showed a star map, thousands of points of light representing worlds where the Pathkeepers had taught their disciplines. Most of these worlds are dark now, Moth observed, checking the current star charts. The civilizations are gone. But not all, Prin said, pointing to 12 lights that still glowed. 12 worlds still show active signatures. Rachel's breath caught as she recognized one of the coordinates. The Pathkeeper's message continued. We do not know if our experiment will succeed. We hope that somewhere, on some world, the lessons will take root deeply enough to survive. That a civilization will carry these teachings forward, keeping them alive even after we are gone. The holographic figure seemed to look directly at Rachel, though she knew it was just a recording made billions of years ago. If you stand here now, student, then you carry our legacy. The forms you practice, the disciplines you maintain, they are older than your world. Older than most stars. Treat them with respect. Pass them on to others. And know that every time you stand in the guard position, every time you center your breath, every time you practice with patience and focus, you connect yourself to a teaching that spans the galaxy and reaches back to the very beginning of civilized life. The hologram began to fade, but not before showing one final image. The Pathkeeper bowing to an unseen student, a gesture of respect from teacher to learner. Then the crystal went dark. The four of them stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Vork spoke, his voice unsteady. This changes everything we know about galactic history. No, Rachel said softly. It changes everything we know about why civilizations survive or fail. Prin was already checking the data. Captain Torres, of the 12 worlds still showing active teaching signatures, 3 went dark in the past 50 years. And another one is fading right now. Rachel turned sharply. Which one? A world called Keth Prime. They stopped teaching their traditional practices 20 years ago according to council records. Current status shows they're on the verge of civil war. Rachel looked at Moth. How long do they have? Based on the pattern from other worlds? Weeks. Perhaps days. The ancient curator's form seemed to sag with the weight of understanding. Every civilization that abandoned these teachings collapsed shortly after. Internal conflict, societal fragmentation, self-destruction. The Pathkeepers were right. Technology without discipline is a path to extinction. Rachel thought about her grandmother, who had insisted she learn the old forms even when they seemed useless in a modern world. About the unbroken line of teachers stretching back through the centuries on Earth. About how humanity had somehow, against all odds, kept these ancient lessons alive. Then we need to go to Keth Prime, she said firmly. Captain Torres, you cannot save an entire civilization, Vork protested. Rachel turned to face him, and something in her expression made the commander step back. The Pathkeepers did it thousands of times. They taught whoever was willing to learn, then trusted the students to carry it forward. She looked back at the darkened crystal. I'm just a student. But maybe that's enough. Moth moved to her side. The council will need to authorize this. Then let's ask them, Rachel said. Because if we don't try, an entire species dies. And the Pathkeeper's legacy dies a little more with them. The council chamber was built to hold representatives from 500 species, but today it felt intimate and tense. Rachel stood in the center, the ancient wakizashi resting on a display stand beside her. Moth had granted special permission to bring it, and its presence seemed to command respect from everyone in the room. Rachel had never spoken to the full council before. Her hands wanted to shake, but she remembered her grandmother's voice. Stand properly. Breathe. Everything else follows. Honorable council members, she began, her voice steady. 3 days ago, I identified an artifact in the archive as matching human design. Since then, we've uncovered evidence that changes our understanding of galactic history. She activated the holographic display, showing the Pathkeeper's message. The council watched in silence as the ancient being explained their mission, their teachings, their hope that the lessons would survive. When it ended, Rachel continued. We've identified a pattern. Civilizations taught by the Pathkeepers share common traits. They develop strong cooperation. They show creativity under pressure. They build societies that can adapt to stress without breaking apart. But when these practices fade, those same civilizations collapse within a single generation. Prin stepped forward, displaying the data. I've analyzed 12 extinct civilizations that stopped teaching their traditional disciplines. All followed the same pattern. First, the practices were seen as outdated or inefficient. Then they were abandoned in favor of pure technological advancement. Within 20 to 30 years, each civilization experienced catastrophic internal conflict and total collapse. A council member from the Vorath collective spoke up, their voice skeptical. You're suggesting that simple physical exercises prevented civilizational collapse? That seems unlikely. Rachel had expected this. It's not about the exercises themselves. It's about what they teach. She stepped away from the podium, finding open space on the floor. May I demonstrate? Without waiting for permission, she moved into a basic kata, the same one that had made the ancient blade resonate. Her movements were clean and purposeful, each position flowing naturally into the next. My grandmother taught me these forms when I was 6, Rachel said as she moved. I didn't understand why at first. They seemed pointless. We have weapons that can destroy planets. Why practice with a sword? We have computers that can solve any problem. Why practice moving slowly and breathing? She completed the form and returned to center. But the practice isn't about fighting or solving problems. It's about teaching your body and mind to work together. To stay calm when everything is chaos. To respect tradition while still moving forward. To focus on the present moment instead of being overwhelmed by the future. She looked around the chamber. The pathkeepers understood something crucial. Technology advances faster than wisdom. A species can develop star travel in a few thousand years, but developing the emotional and social maturity to use that technology responsibly takes much longer. These practices, these disciplines, they're a shortcut. They teach patience, respect, self-control, and focus in a way that lectures and laws never could. Another council member spoke, this one more thoughtfully. And you believe Keth Prime is failing because they abandoned these teachings? I know they are, Prin interjected, pulling up new data. I accessed Keth Prime's public records. 20 years ago, their government declared traditional movement practices to be inefficient uses of education time. They closed the training halls and redirected resources to technological development. 5 years later, social cohesion began to decline. 10 years later, regional tensions started rising. 15 years later, open conflict. Now they're weeks away from all-out war. The display showed images from Keth Prime. The Kethani people had beautiful crystalline skin that reflected light in stunning patterns. But in recent images, those same bodies were covered in fractures and cracks. Their bodies were literally breaking under the stress. It's not just social, Moth added, floating forward to join them. The Kethani evolved a biomechanical harmony that requires specific movements to maintain. Their traditional practices weren't just cultural. They were biological necessity. Without them, their bodies are failing along with their society. Vork stood, and Rachel tensed, expecting opposition. But the commander's expression was thoughtful. What do you propose, Captain Torres? Let me go to Keth Prime, Rachel said simply. Let me try to teach them what the pathkeepers taught us. I can't promise it will work. I'm not a pathkeeper. I'm just someone who learned from teachers in an unbroken line going back thousands of years on Earth. But if there's any chance I can help them remember what they've forgotten, we have to try. One human cannot save an entire civilization, a council member objected. The pathkeepers often traveled alone, Moth countered quietly. They didn't save civilizations with armies or technology. They taught one student at a time, trusting that knowledge to spread. Rachel nodded. I'm not going to save Keth Prime. Only the Kethani can do that. But maybe I can remind them of tools they already have. Tools their ancestors knew but they've forgotten. The council deliberated for less than an hour, which Prin whispered was remarkably fast. When they reconvened, the decision was unanimous. Rachel would go to Keth Prime with full diplomatic authorization. Prin would accompany her to document the attempt. Vork insisted on providing a small security detail, though Rachel suspected it was more to protect the mission than her specifically. Before she left, Rachel returned to the army one last time. She stood alone in front of the darkened crystal, feeling the weight of what she was about to attempt. Moth appeared in the doorway, silent as always. The ancient curator approached and handed Rachel something wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, her breath caught. The wakizashi. The 8-billion-year-old blade. I can't take this, Rachel protested. It belongs in the archive. It belongs in the hands of a student, Moth said firmly. That's what the pathkeepers would have wanted. Besides, it responded to you, Captain Torres. Perhaps it's been waiting all these billions of years for someone who would understand what it truly is. Rachel held the ancient weapon, feeling the perfect balance her hands already knew. What if I fail? Then you fail with honor, having tried. Moth's ancient eyes held hers. But Captain Torres, there's something you should know. The Pathkeeper's final message, the part 1 didn't show the council, it included a warning. What warning? When the last student forgets the first lesson, the teacher must return. Moth gestured to Rachel, to the blade, to the army around them. I think that's what's happening. The Pathkeepers are gone, but their teachings remain. And those teachings are calling out, through you, trying to reach one more civilization before it's too late. Rachel secured the blade carefully. I just hope I'm good enough. You practice every day. You honor your teachers. You understand that discipline is freedom, not restriction. Moth's form seemed to smile. That makes you exactly what Keth Prime needs. The journey to Keth Prime took 3 days. Rachel spent most of it practicing, moving through forms in the ship's cargo bay, the ancient wakizashi feeling both foreign and familiar in her hands. Prin studied everything they could find about Kethani culture, looking for connections to their lost practices. When they finally approached the planet, the comm system lit up with warnings and distress signals. Weapons platforms in orbit. Evacuation orders. Civilian casualties. The war had already begun. Prin looked at Rachel with barely concealed worry. We might be too late. Rachel thought about her grandmother, about the Pathkeepers, about the unbroken chain of teaching that had somehow survived billions of years. Then we work with the time we have, she said. How fast can you find me anyone willing to learn? The landing coordinates put them in a neutral zone between the two warring factions, a stretch of rocky terrain that neither side wanted badly enough to fight over. Rachel's boots touched Keth Prime soil for the first time, and immediately she noticed the temperature, the gravity just slightly lighter than Earth's, the way the air tasted of minerals and ozone. The Kethani were even more striking in person than in recordings. Their crystalline skin caught the light of their blue sun and scattered it in subtle rainbows. They were tall and graceful, moving with a fluidity that reminded Rachel of dancers. But the ones she saw here, the refugees fleeing the conflict zones, were covered in visible cracks. Deep fractures ran through their bodies like broken glass, and some limped or moved stiffly, as if movement itself caused pain. Prin had managed to send messages ahead through what remained of the academic networks. A small group agreed to meet them, though the response had been skeptical at best. Most Kethani were too busy surviving to care about ancient history or human theories. The meeting place was an abandoned temple, its walls still decorated with faded images that Rachel immediately recognized. Kethani in traditional poses, their bodies aligned and whole, moving through forms that looked remarkably similar to Tai Chi. The irony wasn't lost on her. The answers they needed were literally painted on their own walls, and they'd stopped seeing them. 7 Kethani waited inside, all elderly by their standards. Most were academics or historians, people too old to fight but still curious enough to wonder why a human had traveled across the galaxy with claims of ancient knowledge. One of them stepped forward, her crystalline body so fractured that Rachel winced just looking at her. I am Shell. You are the human who says you can help us. The translator caught the skepticism in her voice perfectly. I'm Rachel Torres. And I don't know if I can help. But I'd like to try. Another Kethani, a male named Vex, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Our world is tearing itself apart. Our people are dying. And you offer what? Physical exercises? Rachel didn't argue. Instead, she moved to an open space in the temple's center, where the floor was still smooth stone. She set down the ancient wakizashi, still wrapped, and turned to face them. May I show you something? She asked. Shell gestured permission, more out of courtesy than interest. Rachel took a breath, centered herself, and began. She moved through the same basic kata she'd performed in the archive, the one that had made the ancient blade resonate. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each position held for a moment before flowing into the next. She focused on her breathing, on the feeling of her feet against the stone, on the way her body aligned itself naturally when she let it. The Kethani watched in silence. Rachel couldn't tell if they were interested or just being polite. She completed the form and returned to center, then looked at Shell. Your temples have images like this on the walls, Rachel said, gesturing to the faded paintings. Your ancestors practiced something similar, didn't they? Shell's expression shifted, something flickering behind the cracks in her crystalline face. The old movements. Yes. My grandmother tried to teach them to me when I was young. Her voice grew distant. I thought they were pointless. Superstition. We had real problems to solve, technology to develop. Can you remember any of it? Rachel asked gently. For a long moment, Shell didn't respond. Then, slowly, she moved to join Rachel in the open space. Her fractured body moved stiffly, painfully, but she assumed a position that Rachel recognized immediately. A basic stance, weight balanced, arms positioned for both stability and movement. Like this, Shell said, her voice uncertain. I think. Rachel nodded and mirrored the position. Yes. Exactly like that. Now breathe. Deep breath in, slow breath out. Feel where your weight sits. Shell tried, her breathing ragged at first. But as she focused, something remarkable happened. The cracks in her crystalline body, the deep fractures that had seemed permanent, began to shift slightly. Not healing, not yet, but aligning. The pieces finding their proper positions again. I feel. Shell's voice was filled with wonder. I haven't felt this steady in years. Vex stepped forward, his skepticism cracking like the fractures in his own body. Show me. Rachel spent the next hour teaching them the most basic forms. Nothing complicated. Just standing properly. Breathing correctly. Moving with intention instead of rushing. Simple things that her grandmother had drilled into her as a child, things she thought were boring until she understood their purpose. The Kethani learned quickly, their bodies remembering what their minds had forgotten. And as they practiced, Rachel saw the physical changes. Stress fractures aligning. Movement becoming smoother. It wasn't magic, she realized. It was biology. The Kethani had evolved needing these movements the same way humans needed sleep or food. Their bodies had been built for this kind of harmony, and without it, they were literally falling apart. By the second day, word had spread. Young Kethani started appearing, fighters from both sides of the conflict, exhausted and broken. They came separately at first, suspicious of each other, hands never far from weapons. But Rachel had only one rule: everyone practiced together, or no one practiced at all. She taught them in groups, showing the same basic forms over and over. Stand properly. Breathe deeply. Move with purpose. The warrior's peace, not the warrior's violence. Something unexpected happened when enemies practiced side by side. The forms created common ground. When a fighter from the northern faction struggled with a position, someone from the southern faction would help adjust their stance. When someone's breathing was wrong, others would gently correct them. The practice demanded focus, and that focus pushed away, at least temporarily, the hatred and fear. Prin documented everything, but even the scholar put down the recording equipment one afternoon to learn. I need to understand this, Prin explained. Not just observe it. A week into Rachel's stay, military leaders from both factions arrived, intent on stopping what they called a distraction from the war effort. Commander Keth from the north and General Vora from the south approached the temple with armed escorts, their demands clear: their soldiers would return to duty immediately. Rachel met them outside, unarmed except for the ancient wakizashi at her side. She didn't argue or plead. She simply invited them to try one kata. Just one. 5 minutes of their time. Keth refused immediately. Vora laughed at the suggestion. But Shell, her body now visibly more whole than when Rachel had arrived, stepped forward. Commanders, I am 70 years old by our count. A week ago, I could barely walk. Look at me now. She moved through a simple form, her crystalline body catching the light, the fractures visibly smaller. This human hasn't brought us weapons or tactics. She's reminded us of something we forgot. Something our bodies need to survive. There was something in Shell's voice, a quiet authority that made even the military leaders pause. One form, Rachel repeated. 5 minutes. If you think it's useless afterward, I won't ask again. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was respect for Shell. But both leaders agreed, and Rachel guided them through the most basic kata, the one she'd learned first as a child. The two commanders stood side by side, enemies for years, moving through positions their ancestors had known. For 5 minutes, they weren't enemies. They were students learning something ancient and essential. When they finished, neither spoke at first. Then Vora, her voice quiet, said, I remember my grandfather doing something like this. Before he died, before the conflict started. He tried to teach me, but I said I didn't have time. Keth nodded slowly, studying his own hands. My body feels clearer. Aligned. I didn't realize how fractured I'd become. They didn't declare peace that day. The war didn't end with a single kata. But both leaders left without taking their soldiers. And the next morning, both returned, not with weapons, but with more Kethany who wanted to learn. 3 months later, Rachel prepared to leave Keth Prime. The weapons platforms in orbit had been deactivated. Training halls were reopening across the planet. Fighting hadn't stopped completely, but it had slowed dramatically. Peace talks had begun, and for the first time in years, both sides were actually listening to each other. Shell walked with Rachel to the transport ship, her body now almost completely healed, the cracks reduced to thin lines that barely showed. "You saved our world," the elderly Kethany said. Rachel shook her head. "I didn't save anything. You saved yourselves. I just reminded you of tools you already had. Will you return?" "I don't think you'll need me to," Rachel said, smiling. "You have teachers now. Students who will become teachers. That's how it's supposed to work." She thought of the pathkeepers, of their trust in their students to carry the lessons forward without them. Back at the archive, Rachel returned the ancient wakizashi to Moth. The curator accepted it but seemed reluctant. "You could keep it," Moth offered. "It belongs here," Rachel said. "Where students can see it and remember what it represents." Moth carefully placed the blade in a new display, but not in the Hall of Mysteries. Instead, it went to a new section, one dedicated to the pathkeepers and their legacy. Next to the 8-billion-year-old wakizashi, Moth placed another sword. Rachel's own practice blade, worn smooth from years of training. The label read, "From Earth, 2347 CE. The teaching continues." The Council formally requested that Earth establish a cultural exchange program, sharing martial disciplines with interested worlds. Rachel accepted the role of coordinator, but she insisted on one condition that she repeated to every species who asked to learn. "These practices aren't about humans being special," she would say. "They're about universal truths. The pathkeepers found them first, and humans were just lucky enough to keep them alive. But they belong to everyone willing to learn." On a dozen worlds now, students of different species stand in training halls, learning to breathe, to balance, to move with purpose. Human teachers work alongside Kethany instructors, Vorath masters, and scholars from species Rachel still struggles to pronounce. Somewhere in the galaxy, in a quiet moment between stars, Rachel sometimes imagines the pathkeepers watching. She hopes they are proud. She hopes they understand that their experiment succeeded, that the teaching survived, that students still remember the first lesson. Stand properly. Breathe deeply. Everything else follows from that. The teaching continues.